What a mess this has turned into. What began as a leak of Trump's new plan to achieve peace in Ukraine has turned into a political battle to guess where the plan came from and who is lying about it. Several senators, including Republican Mike Rounds, said that Secretary of State Marco Rubio had told them that the plan was Russia's wish list, not a US plan. Rubio then came out to deny this, while at the same time Trump appeared defending this supposed Russian wish list and making it his own. So, who is lying in this story? Well, we don't know, and we probably never will. Frankly, it seems that the senators are telling the truth, and in this video you'll understand in detail why I say this. What we do know, however, is that in recent hours, representatives from Ukraine and the United States have been negotiating in Geneva on this infamous 28-point plan, and have reduced it to 19 points.
U.S.-Ukraine moved closer together on peace plan after lengthy talks. The document, which Ukraine said was too favorable to Russia, has been substantially changed.
A new draft that, in this case, has not yet been leaked, but which makes one thing clear. Right now, the negotiations are in chaos. Russia seems to have the upper hand, and Trump is willing to defend Moscow's terms. Now, why do I say Moscow's terms? Well, the peace plan we know so far, if anything, is somewhat similar to that of the Gaza war.
Американська сторона надала свої пропозиції, пункти плану, щоб закінчити війну. Їхнє бачення. Ми з перших днів війни займаємо одну надзвичайно просту позицію. Україні потрібен мир. І справжній мир, такий, який не зламає третє вторгнення. Америці по силам зробити так, щоб російська налаштованість на закінчення війни нарешті стала серйозною. Буду заради цього працювати і надалі.
As we have learned, this plan was drawn up by Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, and also by his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. So in case you missed it, the very same people who pushed the Gaza plan. It's also been revealed that the plan was written in direct collaboration with the Russians. However, the problem is that it treats the Ukrainians almost as if they were Hamas terrorists, rather than victims of an unprovoked invasion. And I'm not exaggerating. The full text of the draft basically contains a bunch of concessions to Russia by Ukraine, and none in the opposite direction. All of this is accompanied by aggressive deadlines, with only a few days to accept, and a new push from the White House to apply pressure and bring this issue to a close, whatever the outcome may be. Now, Marco Rubio, who doesn't seem very happy with the plan, is trying to calm the waters by involving the Ukrainians in a major modification of the plan. But if this whole mess makes one thing clear, it's precisely what we on VisualPolitik have been saying for some time. The Trump administration's goal is to put an end to this mess, even if it means kicking Europe and Ukraine's positions to the curb. And besides, if you thought Trump's romance with Putin was over, well, it appears not. So what exactly does this controversial plan consist of? What demands from the Kremlin does it recognize? What has Trump gotten from Putin? Could Ukraine really accept it? What is the situation in Zelensky's country? And be warned, because I can tell you in advance that today we have some bad news, but also some more hopeful news. We'll tell you all about it and more in today's video.
To no one's surprise,
the plan I'm about to tell you about isn't just the White House's plan. As I said, it was drawn up with Moscow's support. Moscow, but not in Kyiv, and without taking the rest of Europe into account either. And obviously, when the starting point is a plan designed for Russia, things are already off to a bad start. The question is, why are we saying this? Well, you see, we could divide the plan into three main blocks: territorial, military, and political economic. So let's start with what is perhaps the most surprising of all, the territorial plan. VisualPolitik community, the leaked plan paradoxically begins by saying that Ukrainian sovereignty will be confirmed, but everything that follows is anything but that. You see, to begin with, Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk would have to be recognized as Russian territory, even by the United States.
Trump planned to end Ukraine war cedes Donbas to Russia.
And note that we're not just talking about the areas currently occupied by Russia, but the entire 3 Ukrainian oblasts. In other words, as you can see on the screen, this means that Ukraine would not only have to give up Donbass, but would also have to cede territories that have not yet been occupied by Russia. And then, as for the Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts, the current front line would be defined as the final border. In other words, the Russians would also keep cities that have been crucial during the war, such as Mariupol Mariupol, Melitopol, and Berdyansk, without having to make any concessions. And that's not all. In the unoccupied territories of Donetsk, a supposedly demilitarized buffer zone would be created, but it would be Russian territory, which Russian forces would theoretically not be allowed to enter. But let me stress, it would still be under Russian sovereignty. And I say in theory because, of course, let's not be naive. Trusting Russia is like trusting a cat to guard a ham. Let's be clear, this would mean a major military victory for Moscow, because Ukraine would lose access to the Sea of Azov forever, and a lot of territory in the east, even more than it has lost during the actual war, without getting anything in return. No concessions or any significant Russian withdrawal that could give Ukraine some breathing room.
Russia would only have to return a few small pieces of occupied territory in the Kharkiv and Sumy Oblast. The only concession, so to speak, given to Ukraine is a supposed guarantee that Russia will allow Ukraine to use the Dnieper River for trade and to export grain without problems via the Black Sea. Clearly, the problem is that with these borders, the Russians would control the Dnieper's outlet to the Black Sea, so that if they wanted to block transport on the river, they could do so without any problem. This results in a significant additional strategic advantage.
Wow. And as if all this were not enough, do you remember the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant that is occupied by Moscow? You know, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe? Well, not only would control not be returned to Kyiv, but on top of that, the electricity it produces would have to be shared equally with the Russians, meaning that Ukraine would lose a huge amount of energy forever. Just what a country that is to recover from a tough war needs. Wow. So with this plan, we would be facing an unmitigated victory for Moscow on the territorial front. A victory that would send a very dangerous message. If you invade another country and resist long enough, the occupied territories will be recognized as yours, and you will be rewarded with a few other things. And you might be wondering, what are these other things? Well, if what we've just told you is disturbing, what comes next is even worse. Trump's plan calls for Ukraine to amend its constitution to include an express prohibition on joining NATO at any time in the future. And remember, NATO, for its part, would also have to prohibit Ukraine's admission to the alliance in its own statutes. Well, not only would Ukrainians be unable to join the Atlantic Alliance, but there are also plans to prohibit NATO troops from entering Ukraine, even for military exercises. This is intended to block the stabilization force that some European countries, such as France and the United Kingdom, had proposed. That would simply not happen. Ukraine would become a kind of pariah country for the world's largest security alliance. And of course, its own sovereignty and ability to decide on its alliances would be destroyed forever. And no, that's not all. Russia and NATO would also be forced to sit down and discuss security issues with the mediation of the United States, which translated into real language means recognizing that NATO has been threatening Russia's security, and that, therefore, there must be dialogue on how to avoid this. Quite a political coup for Putin. So the question is, where is this document headed? Well, here comes the most peculiar part of all. NATO could not expand any further. Any country that Russia considered close to its supposed security zone could never join the alliance. In exchange, Russia would give its guarantee not to invade neighboring countries, at least for now. A guarantee that obviously can be laughed at because of the Budapest Memorandum that led to the surrender of Ukraine's nuclear weapons in 1994 said exactly the same thing. Now, beyond the joke that this implies, do you know what it means? First, another political point for Putin, because it means recognizing that NATO has been to blame for everything by accepting countries that have freely applied for membership. And second, it's a blow to countries such as Moldova, or perhaps even to a possible future transition of power in Belarus, because it stands to reason that knowing that they will never be able to count on NATO would leave them forever in a much more exposed position. Therefore, it would not be in their interest to be on bad terms with Moscow. VisualPolitik community, all this basically means buying into the narrative that Russia has been the victim of a constant threat to its national security from the Atlantic Alliance. A delusion. Along these lines, a limitation on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces is also set down. A limitation that in practice means nothing, but which is another kick against Kyiv, and another political point for Putin. You know, the art of the deal. And okay, I'm sure many of you are thinking, but Josh, wouldn't the plan really give Ukraine a single guarantee? Wouldn't it leave them completely exposed? Well, no, that's not it. On paper, there would be guarantees. Of course, in practice, it would probably be a different story. Because yes, the plan does mention the security guarantees that Zelensky so desired for the first time. According to a member of the US government, these would be explicit guarantees from the United States, although it does not specify exactly how they would be formulated. The only thing the text does say is that that the United States would be compensated for these guarantees. In other words, on top of everything else, the Ukrainians would probably have to pay them in some way for this. Wow! At least it does say that if Russia invaded the country again, there would be a coordinated military response. Who knows what that means? Sanctions against Russia would return, and the recognition of the territories occupied by Moscow would be revoked. But does anyone really believe that this military response would involve US troops in a possible future conflict? Seems hard to believe. Well, if all this already seems in some ways like a tailor-made suit for Putin, cut by the Oval Office tailor, there's still one last area: the political and economic aspects of the plan. Yes, there's more. After the end of the war, the United States guarantees that Russia will be reintegrated into the international community, both politically and economically, as if nothing had happened. To give you an idea, sanctions would be lifted, they would be invited back to the G8, and the United States would openly promote its business with Moscow. Washington is committed to promoting investment in energy, artificial intelligence, data centers, and rare earth mining in the Arctic, among many other things. In other words, when talking to Putin, Trump quickly switches from America first to Russia first. While Trump demands that the rest of the world, including close allies, invest in the United States so as not to step on their toes, with Russia it's the opposite. As I said, Russia first.
For any plan to work, it needs Ukrainians and Europeans on board. So this is very clear. Also, we have to understand that in this war there is one aggressor and one victim, so we haven't heard of any concessions on the Russian side.
However, finally there has been one concession, albeit a tiny one. Moscow would have to invest $100 billion of its frozen assets in a US-led fund for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Note that this is an investment, not compensation for Ukraine. It would have a share of the ownership of the assets. And note what the plan says.
The US will receive 50% of the profits from this venture. Europe will add $100 billion to increase the amount of investment available for Ukraine's reconstruction.
Yeah, you understood correctly. Not only would the United States not put in a single dollar, but it would also take 50% of the profits reaped by this initiative, if any, despite not putting in a single cent. And Europe would have to come up with another $100 billion at Washington's request, which would come from European taxpayers' pockets. And all this while Europe also pays for humanitarian aid and Ukraine's future security, has to return frozen funds to the Russians, and has had no say in these negotiations. Europe's opinion is neither present nor taken into account anywhere, despite the fact that Washington is forcing them to put up the money that they are no longer willing to pay. Europeans have been by far the largest donors of aid to Ukraine since the war broke out. They are currently footing the bill for the conflict and will have to pay the bills in the future. And all this while complying with the demand from the White House: watch, listen, and remain silent. What's more, the United States reserves preferential access to do business in Ukraine, which, incidentally, could hinder this country's access to the European Union itself, reserves the profits to be made, and will be the ones to lead trade agreements with Russia. To put it bluntly, this is yet another humiliation of Brussels by Trump. Europeans are being treated like nobodies who have no say, except when it comes to opening up their wallets. It's a slap in the face. Yet another one for Brussels, Berlin, Paris, London, and all Europeans, in exchange for no concessions from Russia. So at the end of the day, with allies like these... Meanwhile, what would Ukraine get in return? Well, the reconstruction plan, financed by Europe and Russia for membership of the European Union, if that is possible with Washington's demands, and in any case, access to the European market in the short term. This peace plan, or rather quasi-surrender, means giving in to Putin on the vast majority of points that the Russian dictator wanted to obtain from this war. In other words, we're basically talking about returning to the initial line taken by Trumpism, forcing Zelensky to kneel before Putin and not making Russia pay for its crimes. Quite the contrary, because Moscow would emerge stronger in all areas. First, they would gain more territory, and all the resources contained therein. And don't forget that Donbass is the area of Ukraine with the most mineral resources and rare earths. Second, Russia is granted supposed security guarantees that Moscow has been demanding for years to reinforce its narrative that all this has been the fault of the West. Third, it would give in to its demands regarding NATO and Ukraine's future in the alliance. Fourth, Russia is automatically opened up economically to the world. And fifth, and most importantly, the rhetoric that Putin has used to justify his invasion, and also during the war, is accepted internationally. Precisely because this is clearly a plan tailored to the Kremlin. There are dissenting voices, even within the United States. And not exactly low-profile people. Keith Kellogg, who until now was the White House special envoy to Ukraine and a close associate of Trump himself, will not return to his post after the Christmas holidays.
Trump's Ukraine envoy Kellogg to leave post in January, sources say.
Kellogg was seen as the most pro-Ukraine figure within the Trump administration, and his positions were reasonably well regarded by both Ukrainians and Europeans. Well, it's understood that he has not been involved at all in this entire plan I've just told you about. It has all been the work of Steve Witkoff, the US negotiator for the Middle East. And not surprisingly, it is taken for granted that his decision to step down as envoy to Ukraine in January is because he disagrees with everything you have been seeing. And the worst thing is that with his departure, Moscow gains another very important point, because in the Kremlin, Kellogg was seen as a very troublesome figure for his interests in the negotiations. And now they've got what they wanted. He's leaving. Getting rid of Kellogg wasn't part of the plan, but it's another collateral win for Moscow, and not a small one at that. Now, despite everything we've told you, don't think that we're living in Groundhog Day or in total defeatism. Despite everything, there is news that could be good for Ukraine. But we'll talk about that soon here on VisualPolitik. So now is the perfect time to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. All you gotta do is just click on that button, and that's it. In just 1 second, you'll be part of this amazing community, and you'll be up to date with all of our latest news. Just press that little button, and that's all. Having said that, the question is, what do you think of this peace plan? Do you think it will come to fruition? Will Ukraine manage to modify it to reinforce its interests, or will it all end up in the trash once again? Leave us your thoughts in the comments and let us know what you think. And if you found this video interesting, give it a like, and see you in the next video here on VisualPolitik, if you haven't forgotten to subscribe to us, that is. Take care, and I'll see you soon.